Last time we saw Aquaman in his own comic, things were looking pretty bleak. Merc, Tula, and SWAT had abandoned their posts in a well-intentioned attempt to break Orm out of Belle Reve prison. As they argued over the best way to do this, Tula was contacted by her squad leader and informed of the Scavengers' attack on Atlantis. This left them in the uncomfortable position of deciding, do they save Orm, or do they return to Atlantis and fulfill their duty? The Scavengers' attack was possible because Aquaman had also left the city. He had been told that Mera was in trouble, so he rushed off to rescue her from the icy clutches of the dead king. This led him to the penal colony of Zebel, which is walled off in another dimension. He succeeded in his mission, saving Mera, but the dead king managed to win over the people of Zebel, who pledged their loyalty to him. In order to fight against him, Aquaman and Mera then returned to Atlantis. They battled against the Scavengers' forces valiantly, but those forces were too many and too powerful. Warden Ern was killed in the conflict, protecting his king bravely. Arthur retaliated by doing what was thought to be impossible, summoning the gigantic Topo. The massive creature began shattering subs. The strain of this caused Aquaman to black out, just as the dead king and his Zebel forces arrived on scene. Most worryingly, though, the dead king called Arthur's legitimacy into question. He claimed that Arthur's ancestors killed his family and tried to kill him. Arthur isn't the king of Atlantis, heir to the founder of Atlantis. He's the descendant of traitors. 6 months later, Arthur woke up in a waterless space. He had been bandaged by and watched over by his old ally and new enemy, Vulko. My name is Ben, and this is Comic Book Breakdown episode 26.21 of Aquaman, where we'll uncover the secret history of Atlantis. Aquaman issue 24 opens with a recounting of Arthur's origin. His father, lighthouse keeper Tom Curry, sailed a boat out into a storm in order to warn a ship away from the shore. He succeeded in his quest, but the storm flipped his boat over. Weighted down by his clothing and rain gear, Tom Curry should have died that night. But instead, he was saved by the princess of Atlantis, a woman named Atlanta. They fell in love. And a year later-ish, Arthur Curry, Aquaman, was born. He should have been the king of Atlantis, king of all the seven seas. Everyone in Atlantis believed this, except Vulko. He found the hidden tomes of the trench. He is the only one who knew the truth. He wanted them to be wrong, though. He wanted no one to ever learn this truth. But now it's all coming apart. Arthur, his mind still struggling to catch up with all of this, doesn't really care about Vulko's mad stories or him, to be honest. He's still struggling with the idea that he's been in a coma for 6 months? Vulko nods. The strain of controlling Topo was too much for him. His mind needed time to heal. In the meantime, the dead king has secured Atlantis. You would have died if I hadn't pulled you out, Vulko says. And here Arthur cuts him off by grabbing his coat. Wait, where is Mera? Vulko doesn't know. The last time he saw her in Atlantis, she was face to face with the dead king. Arthur lets him go, dumping him to the ground. Where are we? He goes to the flap of the tent and pulls it open, revealing a mountainous, frozen landscape. They are in Antarctica. It's the safest place for them. The dead king's forces would never think to look for them here. I know you blame me for the war, Vulko says, but believe me when I say that I am still your loyal servant and advisor, Arthur. I only want what's best for Atlantis, and most of all for you, my king. Now he gestures to a large crack in the ground. There was once a research station over there, but it collapsed when the dead king opened his tomb. Everything that they need to know, everything that he wished wasn't true, is down there. Still very untrusting of Volko, Arthur grabs him by the collar again, but this time he jumps into the crack. Maybe he has to do this, sure, but he doesn't have to trust Volko. We saw this research station collapse back in Aquaman issue 18, and there were 2 men who were stationed in it. Arthur comes across the frozen corpse of one of them as they descend into the darkness. They stop before a shattered, icy throne inside of a chamber. A small wall of columns surround it, and standing above those columns is a ring of statues. There are 6 in total, each one holding a weapon or a claw towards the center where the throne is. The majority of them appear human, although 2 definitely do not. One of them appears to be a member of the Trench, while another has a crab-like face. They all wear armor and fantasy clothing of varying designs, and 2 of them, including the crab-faced one, appear to be female. "What is this?" Arthur asks. Volko's eyes scan over the room. "This is the secret of the 7 seas." "What kind of tomb is this?" Arthur asks. "And who built it? Why?" "If you take the throne, you'll see all the answers yourself," Volko explains. Arthur argues for a second, believing that Volko is suggesting that he retake the throne literally, like be a king again, that it's his birthright. But no, Volko explains, that is not what he means. Being the king of Atlantis is actually not his birthright. I mean, just sit in the chair, Arthur. "Enough, Volko," Arthur says. "Just tell me." And here Volko finally cuts him off. "Look, just take the throne and it will tell you everything. Please. You might not trust me, but I clearly mean you no harm. I could have hurt you at any time during these last few months, and I didn't." Watching Volko carefully, Arthur walks up the wide steps to the frozen throne. He slowly sits down in it. "Who are these people?" he asks. "The throne, I guess?" The ice suddenly jumps, freezing over his arm in seconds. Arthur breaks free, shouting that he should never have trusted Volko. "Let it take you, my king," the old man shouts back. "If you want to stop the dead king, to save Mera, to see Atlantis again, then let it take you. It will hurt. It will be painful in many horrible ways," he says, as Arthur is engulfed by the ice. "But there is no other way." That is a lot of setup. Some of the work that author Jeff Johns is doing here is clearly catching the audience up with where we left off. After all, thanks to the launch of Forever Evil and the Villains Month issues, it has been 2 months between Aquaman issue 23 and this issue in particular, issue 24. So Johns catches us up to speed by having Volko info dump the basics of who Aquaman is and how he got into this position. He then establishes Arthur and Volko's relationship, that Aquaman doesn't trust him because of starting the war, but he needs Volko because the old man just knows so much. He's actually seemed to have known so much since the beginning. Or at least he knew before Arthur's latest stint as the king. This exposition and lack of trust is demonstrated in Arthur asking so many questions, allowing Johns, through Volko, to fill us in on the answers. I love that the first question that Arthur asks, once it's established that he's okay, is where Mera is. She is pretty much the last person in Arthur's private life that he loves, cares for, and trusts completely. And so I love seeing his consideration for her being such a priority for him. She is more important than Atlantis. She is more important than the surface world. She is his world. And she's ultimately what he wants to get back to. That's fantastic. It actually feels a bit frustrating as a reader that Volko doesn't tell Arthur the truth that he keeps hinting at all. He just keeps telling him to sit down on the throne. It happens like 2 or 3 times in dialogue in the short amount of pages that we have for this scene. But it does make sense that Volko would rather have Arthur sit down in the throne and literally experience what he is about to see and experience than just take him at his word. He knows that Arthur doesn't trust him. We see that distrust demonstrated in these opening pages. Having Arthur get the information that he is about to get personally bypasses his distrust of Volko completely and speeds along their story. There is an element of this scene that makes me chuckle, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on with it. During the retelling of Arthur's origin, we see Atlanta find and save a drowning Tom Curry. We only see a single panel of her, just her torso sticking out of the ocean waves, and she is colored as if she is wearing clothes. But I don't think that she is actually drawn wearing anything. Her hair is even specifically draped over her chest, hiding her breasts, which makes me think that penciler Paul Palletier drew her as tastefully nude, but colorist Rod Reis applied colors as if she was wearing clothing. This is particularly interesting because this is actually the first time that we see Atlanta in the New 52 continuity at all. They are establishing her general appearance here in this single panel, and thanks to this weird presentation, we actually get a weird mixed look. It feels unconfident, I think is the best way to describe it, which is not something that I would normally say about Paul Pelletier's artwork at all, and it's something that I never thought I would say about Johns' run on Aquaman in general. While I do feel like he has made small mistakes here and there, overall, it has felt like he came into this book with a plan, and as the book has gone on, I do think that he has executed each step in that plan more and more confidently. This thing with Atlanta feels more like a slip-up, perhaps a sign that the detailed focus on Aquaman as a storytelling unit was slipping as Geoff Johns prepared to leave the title. I have no proof of that, but it is a possible explanation for why this error happens. Anyways, back at the throne, as the ice covers Arthur's body, he can hear a voice. "Beware being buried in this tomb. Beware Atlan, king of Atlantis. He was the architect, the builder, and the king of Atlantis, but he was also its death." We can actually see Atlantis, ancient Atlantis, how it was before it sank. A beautiful golden city stretches out below us. Domed buildings and tall spires topped with careful statues line the shoreline. Gardens and greenery take up the free space between buildings. Standing on a balcony overlooking the city is a muscular, handsome man. He's dressed in golden armor, still fish-themed oddly enough, with scale armor and a purple cape. In one hand is the trident that we have seen Arthur wielding since this series began, the Trident of the King. He has thick brown hair and a neat beard. He honestly looks very regal. It suits him, like this dude looks like a king. This is Atlan, the first king of Atlantis, the man who would go on to become the dead king. And, if you're paying attention, the armor that he is shown wearing here is the same armor that the dead king wears, just without thousands of years of aging on it. That is a nice detail. A voice calls from behind him, "Father?" He turns and smiles. "Children!" Two kids, one boy and one girl, approach with their mother. Atlan hugs his children, who are happy to see him home at last. But his wife is a bit more apprehensive. "How long are you home for, Atlan?" she asks. "Is our war with the desert?" "Yes, the wars are over, Sala. The deserters will not only join us, but they have agreed to share the power of their sands with us." Sala smiles. "Then there is hope for peace yet." "There is always hope within Atlantis," he says. "Our nation will unite this world, just as we have united the kingdoms of the old lands." The narrator then continues, saying that as the years went on, Atlantis continued to grow. Atlan's tolerance for outsiders grew, and he invited all to join the great nation. But by doing so, he was leading us toward a world of mongrels. We see Sala and Atlan walking through the city. Atlan agrees that his brother and sister-in-law do lead a suspicious sect, sure, but with work and time they can win them over, earn their trust. Atlantis is for everyone, after all. They will earn their trust, and then they will have peace. The narration continues. "Atlan had to be stopped. Finally, There were those who swore to stop him. Atlan and Sala arrive at the throne room and find their thrones occupied. The male sitting in Atlan's seat has long blonde hair and a full beard. He definitely bears a resemblance to Arthur. He too is dressed in armor, but he wields a silver version of the scepter of the dead king, and it is covered in blood. Sitting to his left is a woman with long white hair, a two-pronged spear in her hands. A pile of dead bodies litters the floor between them. "Peace, Atlan?" the blonde man asks. "Peace in exchange for the eradication of our people?" "Orin," Atlan says in horror. Sala drops back behind him. "What have you done?" "I have made a decision, brother," Orin says. "I will stop the madness of mixing the races together. I will not stand by and watch as you lead us down a path of self-destruction, and neither will my people." A bunch of warriors charge in, covered in armor and wielding spears. Atlan stabs one with his trident. "Go, Sala! Get to the children!" he shouts. She hesitates, but he shouts for her to go! "Meet me where I first took your hand! Now go, please!" Tears in her eyes, Sala leaves. "Your queen cannot escape us, brother," Orin says, charging in. "She will die for your sins. We must preserve the races of the world." And he sinks his scepter into Atlan's right side. Ugh! "King Orin saved us from Atlan's misguided and mistaken dream," the narrator continues. But then we see Atlan swing his arm up, breaking off the top of the scepter and knocking Orin back. But as the traitor reels, several spear tips enter Atlan's back. The narrator continues. "It took 7 of Orin's most skilled warriors, and Orin himself, to weaken Atlan. But it was still not enough to kill him." Atlan threw himself from the throne room into the waves below. He waited until nightfall to return, entering the city through its waterways that night. He worked his way through the city, heading to his family. But when he got to them, he was too late. We see Atlan drop to his knees in shock, horror, and disbelief. No. Atlan's dreams for Atlantis died that night. From then on, Atlan and his loyalists were hunted. Using the arcane knowledge of the deserters and their sand, Atlan forged the 6 artifacts of Atlantis: the Seal of Clarity, the Helm, the Orb of Transportation, the Key, the Manacles of Force, and the Scepter, or, as we've seen it called in this comic, the Dead King's Scepter. This process took him years. When he returned, Atlan did so with a quiet fury. He killed his brother and his queen, and as a civil war raged around him, he finally had enough. As the rain fell in sheets, Atlan raised his scepter. "Let it all die!" And when he brought it down, Atlantis shattered and sank into the waters, into myths and legend. 90% of the city's population died that day, their lungs filled with water. But there were those who survived. The 7 kingdoms were gone, 4 of them utterly destroyed by this act. The 3 that remained changed, they evolved, and here we see images of the Trench, Arthur and Mera. The Trench, Atlantis, and Zebel, the 3 surviving kingdoms. In the real world, Arthur breaks through the ice, shouting for Volko. Doing so took all of his strength, so he collapses to his knees. I don't understand. What did I just see?" Volko takes his arm, trying to help him up. "You saw the truth." Arthur shrugs out of his arm. If that was the truth, then you've been lying to me since the day I met you. You're lying to me even now." But Volko just looks at him sadly. "I cannot afford to protect you with lies anymore. Atlan has risen from his tomb, and he wants revenge on Atlantis. You see now why it was so important to hide this information. You're not the descendant of Atlan. You're a descendant of his traitorous brother, Orym. Atlan was once the greatest hero of the world, and your ancestors were the villains. Wow. This issue is very straightforward. It's essentially one huge info dump, one that connects a lot of the background elements that Johns has been seeding during his 2-year run on Aquaman. The trench, the artifacts, the existence of Atlantis at all, even Orym and Arthur's legitimate claims to the throne, all of this ties back into this lost history. I would like to note that if you are a longtime Aquaman fan, then these changes at the time were huge. The character Orym previously existed in DC continuity, and he was actually the one credited with saving Atlantis when it sank by developing the massive dome that protected the city. Then, one of his scientists developed a formula to turn air breathers into amphibians. Orym tested it on himself first, making sure that it worked, and then he had it administered to the rest of the city, creating the first generation of undersea Atlanteans. So rebuilding Orym into a bad guy here was a huge change to continuity. I don't know if longtime Aquaman fans were upset at this change, because sometimes fans get very protective of the mythology and lore that they have grown up with. But as an outsider to DC lore in general, I think that this is fun. It's an interesting twist to the character. That explanation also explains how previously surface-dwelling Atlanteans changed into water-breathing ones, a story element that Geoff Johns just kind of skips over mentioning here. My largest complaint with this issue is a lot of stuff like that. There are elements of the Atlantean story that just don't line up very well. With Johns finishing his run next issue, we'll never get to see him explore these concepts properly. This is all that we get. First off, ancient Atlantis' design motifs are all still inspired by the sea. The armor has fish fins on it, the warriors wear scale mail armor, coral designs litter the walls of the city, and there are seashells worked into the designs of the thrones. This feels like a very odd design element, as Atlantis isn't a sea-based culture at this point. Sure, they are an island in the Mediterranean, according to mythology, so they're definitely a sea-going people. But to have their main look be ocean-inspired feels out of place. Rather than being a place that modern Atlantis could have evolved out of, this just looks like modern-day Atlantis, but, above the water. We're talking about thousands of years of time passing between that version of Atlantis and the modern one that we've been seeing under the sea. It just doesn't make sense to me that they would look basically the same in all ways. You just look at the difference between America now and the way America looked in 1776, and it is vastly different in terms of architecture, clothing design, the technology that we use. You would think that the most advanced nation on the planet 9,000 years ago, or however long DC wants to say it is, would look drastically different from the way it looks in modern age. Secondly, we've got the tomb that the dead king escaped from. What's the deal with that? What's the deal with the dead king's tomb? We're shown that Atlan's quote-unquote last act was the sinking of Atlantis, killing most of its population and destroying the pinnacle of ancient civilizations at the time. So, who was left to build this tomb for him? I would assume loyalists, but it's not like we're told at all. And even if they were loyalists, why would they put the weird narration ice there? It's evident that whoever sits on that throne would be engulfed in the ice. So, are you telling me that the dead king just sat there for literally thousands of years and had this narrated message played on loop for him? Who would do that? And why would they do that? If loyalists made it, then you would think it would make more sense to create a video that, talked up how freaking awesome Atlan was. How just his anger at being betrayed was, and how necessary his actions were in destroying Atlantis. He did it because it was the right thing to do. He was saving it from the traitor Orym, but that's not what we get. The narration says that Orin saved Atlantis from interbreeding and a watering down of its culture. Orin is presented as a hero here. That would actually be my third complaint, that the message of the narration is really mixed. On the one hand, it glorifies Atlan's historical actions, selling us on the idea of a united world under Atlan being a good thing. But then, when Orin betrays him, the narration switches its tone to Orin saving the world from Atlan's influence. I absolutely believe that history can have more than one layer to it, and that the truth is always going to be more complicated than any single story can present. But any single historian will still present one vision, whatever it is that they learned and are familiar with. If loyalists were the people who made this tomb, you'd think that they would make a video glorifying their former king. If rebels were the ones who made the tomb, you would think that they would make a video pointing out that he was a genocidal warlord, killing whoever he had to in order to get them to agree to his alliance. We were told there was a war with the deserters until they agreed to turn over their secrets to Atlan. This guy's a warlord. He's a conqueror. You have bad propaganda you could spread about him, and instead you get this weird mixed message. And along those lines, Atlan is presented initially as this great unifier, right? But he also created Xebel, which is the exact opposite of being a unifier. Like, he cut off an entire society of people from this dimension. He created a portal that required the sacrifice of a boat. And keep in mind, this would have been thousands of years ago. Boats weren't exactly mass-produced at the time, as far as we know, because we don't really know what the rest of the world looked like during the time of Atlantis. But still, they would still have to have a boat, they would still have to sink it, and then they would still have to go underwater into this underwater colony that didn't exist at the time because Atlantis hadn't sunk yet, and the Atlanteans weren't amphibians yet. So I'm assuming that Atlan stuck dissenters to his vision there. Like, who else is he going to put there, right? Like, clearly these are the people who didn't agree with what he was doing in Atlantis. But if Atlan was willing to go to war over this unifying idea, then why not just kill the dissenters? Why not imprison his brother there? And I could believe that maybe Atlan was sick of the killing, so he exiled people instead. Maybe he didn't believe that his brother would actually turn on him and try to kill him. Like, my brother doesn't agree with me, but he would never do that, right? I certainly don't expect my brother to do that at any point in my life. But we are told that he knows that Orin is unhappy with his expansionist ways. He outright says that he will win his brother over with trust and peace. He knows that Orin is dangerous, and he's got a place to stick dangerous people in. That's the whole point of Xebel. And wouldn't it make sense if the two, from a storytelling balance perspective, wouldn't it make sense to have Atlantis kind of be the place that Orin influenced but then left behind, and you got this weird history, while over in Xebel, the colony that thinks Atlantis is wrong and Atlantis is evil and that Atlantis hates them there would have been ruled over by Atlan in the meantime, because he's sitting there going, Atlantis isn't what it used to be. Orin took it over. He hates me. What an a-hole. Like, wouldn't that make sense from a storytelling perspective? More so than this weird thing that we got? It's really hard to get a good picture of who Atlan and Orin are in this story and what their motivations are with this single issue. Much like Orm, and to be fair, this is something that I really like, Atlan is more complicated than just being a good guy or a bad guy. That's interesting, and it leaves room for more stories. And as frustrated as I am by what I would call the mess of storytelling that this is, I do think that that potential being open-ended is a good thing. As I touched upon earlier, Geoff Johns does absolutely nothing to explain how a group of people who previously lived above water could just be dumped into the water and then somehow they survived. We're told that over time, the people of Atlantis and Xebel evolved into the water breathers that they currently are, but like how? I'm assuming that the Atlanteans and the Xebels didn't start evolution as baseline humans. Like, even ancient Atlanteans must have had a genetically distinct yet similar race from humanity. Maybe their race hyper evolves when facing a challenge somehow. Because I have no idea how you drop a city into the water and have the people who live there live long enough to develop flooping gills. It would have made more sense that Atlantis sunk and some people just survived on debris and moved to the mainland. That would be, in theory, that's how you get modern societies, right? These people could have gone to... Atlantis was somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, in theory, past the... what is it, the Strait of Hercules? So, I mean, they would have been in, like, what, Spain and Western Africa, like northwestern Africa, and that's where you could seed life from there, and these people went on to do other stuff. The fact that they somehow stayed underwater long enough to just go, wait a minute, I'm not drowning. I guess I'll just live here for the rest of my life. Like, that kind of boggles my mind. That's such weird storytelling. The fact that we just skip that whole change. So along even those lines, the dead king claims to have created the penal colony of Zebul, right? We just covered that. But the Zebuls didn't evolve into water breathers until after the sinking of Atlantis, which is the last time that anyone saw the dead king. So how did Atlan make an underwater kingdom in another dimension that he was somehow allies with? Because keep in mind, he is saying that the Zebul was one of the 7 kingdoms. They are an ally at the time. They are not an enemy. But how did he know to create it underwater, knowing that the Zebuls would evolve into water-breathing people after the fall of Atlantis at some point? And he also knew in the present day that the Trench were almost killed by Arthur, and evidently the Trench were once his subjects, so that's like, whoa, you're trying to kill your own people? But how did the dead king know that information in the modern day? My final complaint about this time period is the idea that anyone of royal blood survives all of this anyways. Volko and Jeff Johns are really playing up this question of Arthur's legitimacy here at the end of the run. That he can't be king because he isn't Atlan's heir specifically. That he can't be the king because he's actually the descendant of the traitor Orin. But how did everyone assume that Arthur's ancestor was Atlan then? Because Atlan's family was all killed. We're even told this earlier in the comic during the Others arc. Arthur tells the others that the king fled into Atlantis to save his family and then he never came out. So okay, that's fine. No one is a descendant of Atlan. But Orin and his wife were also killed. And even if you tell me that they had a child or maybe a couple children, the flooping island of Atlantis sunk into the flooping ocean, killing 90% of the population. You're telling me that of that 90% of the population, some of them lucked out to be Orin's kids, who then didn't die in the following period of upheaval and chaos? Their society just went to civil war and then collapsed, and then literally collapsed into the ocean. They collapsed both physically and metaphorically, with the leadership structure completely dead and destroyed, and all of their supporting alliances were gone. How anybody from Atlantis survived this catastrophe is beyond me, much less how anyone with royal ties to the throne survived. And even if that is the case, that Atlan and Orin do share a parent, right? They are brothers. Arthur is still of the royal bloodline. He just isn't Atlan's heir. And Atlan, for all the supposed goodness that was sold here with this story, did choose to flooping sink Atlantis and everybody on it. Orin might have betrayed his brother and the spirit that Atlantis was founded in, but Atlan is the one who put a gun to its head and pulled the trigger. Atlan is the one who killed it. He is not a good man. Why you would want to tie your royal bloodline to this is ridiculous. None of these people are good people. Both of them no swearing up. And none of this story should invalidate Arthur's right to rule. After all, Atlantis has existed for thousands of years since its fall into the ocean. If we assume that every ruler who ruled Atlantis then lived for approximately 100 years, that means that there have been, at least 10 other rulers who weren't Atlan's descendants, and nobody called into question their legitimacy. Somebody has to rule, somebody needs to be in charge, and it might as well be Arthur, who's at the very least a good dude. Johns is, of course, doing all of this to force Arthur into accepting the throne regardless of history. He is saying that Arthur shouldn't do it out of a duty to protect the surface world. He shouldn't do it out of a duty to blood, not because the history of Atlantis demands it, but because he is the best guy for the job. And he is the best guy for the job because he's a hero, and he wants what's best for people. I also want to point out that none of this explains how or why Atlan is alive, or why he has developed ice powers, or why this telepathic history channel of ice exists. The dead king was able to use his telepathic ice to tell the Zebel people his history and win them over, which implies that he is the one creating the telepathic ice. So, did he create his own tomb and seal himself into that tomb with a historic loop of telepathic ice replaying his greatest tragedy ever over and over and over again? Like, no wonder the dude went crazy, but like, why would he do that? Oh, and I am confused by the existence of the dead king's scepter specifically at this point. Orin was the one who used the original scepter of that design in his attempt to kill Atlan, which Atlan is shown shattering, like he gets stabbed into his side and he goes, bah! And then he escapes into the sea. So when he made what we would refer to as the Dead King's Scepter, he made the second one, the golden one that we have seen in this comic that grants you powers over the Trents. And I'm assuming maybe he made it as a ironic...
No swearing.
...to Orin, right? You attempted to destroy me with this thing, now I'll destroy everything with my version of it, kind of deal. But if that is the case, why does the scepter give control over the trench? Especially since we were just told that the trench didn't even exist when the scepter was first created. And why does the Dead King have another one of those exact same scepters? He came out of the tomb with one. Did the people who entombed him really craft a copy of the thing that destroyed Atlantis to just leave with him in jail for eternity? Why would you do that? Because that seems super odd. Again, maybe it's something that a loyalist would do to honor the power of the dead king, but I don't think a rebel would do that. So clearly I got problems here. I got problems here for days. The overall structure of the individual issue works, but other than connecting the established pieces of lore, I think that this particular issue really suffers from story compression. I could have seen, an entire 6-issue arc set in this time period, exploring Atlan's motivations, his relationship with Orin, and his relationship with the other kingdoms. Cramming everything into this single issue is just a travesty of storytelling, and it is a waste of just so much potential in my mind. It does convey what we need to know in terms of Arthur's forward story momentum, but it does little else. Artistically, this issue shines, because of course it does. Paul Palletier's pencils are detailed and gorgeous, creating a vibrant world that I am sad to see go, and designing new characters whose lack of exploration quite frankly frustrates me. He is inked in this issue by Sean Parsons, who pretty much sticks to Palletier's line work faithfully. Colorist Rod Reis does a good job with the issue, contrasting the cold blues of Antarctica with lots of golden and yellow colors for the flashback. This is supposed to be a veritable golden age, after all, and it looks it wink. One of the things that I particularly like is that Rod Reis colored the pages outside of the panels, what we refer to as the gutters, with a parchment effect. This reinforces the fact that we are looking at old history, even if the art style being presented with and the coloring looks incredibly modern. That's neat and smart storytelling. I originally had a huge rant as well, as if I didn't already have a huge rant, right? But I originally had a huge rant in this part of the script about how much storytelling potential was wasted with the destruction of the other 4 kingdoms and their races, and how cool their visuals were, and how much I really wanted Geoff Johns to expand and explore the mythology of the undersea world of DC, and how much it frustrated me that he didn't. But then I read issue 25 for the breakdown, and it kind of cleaned up my perspective on that a little bit. This moment right here is why I only cover comics that have finished their runs on Breakdown, so that I can get as much of the picture as I possibly can. I don't want to yell at y'all for 6 paragraphs of like, this author did something terrible and I hate it. And then just, I read the next issue and it completely invalidates all of those complaints. Context. It matters, y'all. So let me give you some more. When issue 25 opens, Aquaman and Volko are making their way south, passing by Spain. Arthur finally asks after the surface world and how it has fared these last 6 months. Volko reports that it's still there. He doesn't really know what's going on with it. That isn't something that he's worried about. Atlantis and the dead king were kind of his main priority. Yeah, all right, fine. So the 7 seas that the dead king claims dominion over actually refers to the 7 kingdoms, Aquaman asks his advisor. Only 3 of the kingdoms remained, Volko reminds him. The other 4 perished in the fall. But what if they didn't? Arthur asks. Atlantis turned into a society of water breathers. Zebul did the same. The Trench, they became Trench-er. So what else could the others have become in all this time? Volko shakes his head. There are no others. They're all extinct. He spent decades searching for any sign of them, and he found nothing. Arthur dives down to a wrecked ship. Well, maybe you weren't searching hard enough, he says. Inside the ship, Volko is surprised to find a pile of gold and treasure. What is this supposed to do to help them? He asks. This is just a smokescreen. This is a shiny distraction, Arthur says, punching through the wooden floor. This is the real treasure. He pulls out the dead king's scepter, the weapon that the king used to sink Atlantis. The scepter didn't grant Volko control over the trench when he used it. It wasn't some kind of magic. The trench must have had some kind of primal recognition of it as a symbol of the king's authority. When Volko used it, he borrowed that authority, and now Arthur is going to do the same, in the hopes of leading the trench against the dead king. As the pair make their way down to the depths that the trench occupy, Volko tries to apologize for manipulating him. Arthur cuts him off. If you're really sorry when this is over, you'll turn yourself in. Volko tries to justify his actions again, but Arthur continues to interrupt. Look, he's heard this all before, and you get the feeling that he isn't really interested, Volko. Sure, Volko wants what's best for Atlantis. He knows that. But Arthur wants what's best for everyone, not just Atlantis. Volko reminds him, though, that he is not the king of everyone. He is the king of Atlantis only, and that's where his focus should be. Apparently I'm not, Arthur counters. I'm the descendant of the man who killed the king's family and sent Atlantis on the road to destruction. He's the king of nothing. Don't put him on a pedestal, Volko, Arthur warns. I have never put you on a pedestal because of your bloodline, Volko says earnestly. It's because of who you are, Arthur. Arthur switches topics. Look, he just wants to find Mara. That isn't true, Volko argues. You took the throne to bring peace between the surface and sea world. That matters, Arthur. Bringing cultures together was Atlan's mission, and it cost him his family's life, Arthur points out. It kind of cost Arthur his family too, in a weird roundabout way. And here Volko can't help but agree with him. The dead king's motivations once upon a time were noble, but he has lost his mind since then. He must be stopped. Arthur shushes him. Shh. I hear the trench, he says. I hear them coming. As bioluminescent forms streak towards them both, Arthur says, stop. And then he shouts, stop! Everything turns black. I don't know if I buy that. Volko tells Arthur that he wants him to be the king because he's just a swell dude who wants what's best for everybody. His bloodline, or potential bloodline, I suppose, has nothing to do with it, he says here. And that sounds like complete hogwash to me. Every time that we see Volko justify wanting Arthur on the throne, he has two reasons for it. One, he's the firstborn son of Atlanta, and two, yeah, it's because Arthur's a good guy. He's a better man than Orm. That's why he wanted him back on the throne. But Volko didn't know that when teenage Arthur showed up on his doorstep, shirtless and wearing damp jeans. He had no measure of Arthur's character at that time. He didn't know that he would make a good king then. He just went, here's a teenager, stick him on the throne, everybody. I'm an advisor again, thank you very much. To be fair, a lot of time has passed between Arthur's first time as king and the current time as king. Maybe back then Volko did just want Arthur on the throne because he was Atlanta's firstborn. But then, as he grew to see the man that Arthur became, maybe he grew to respect him for who he was. And when Arthur stepped down from the throne, Volko became driven to get him back, no matter the cost. That's fitting, I suppose, but that is not what we're told here. That's me pulling out answers from the air in hopes of justifying these story choices. I also hate Jeff Johns' attempt to hand-wave the events of Forever Evil by having Volko just be like, oh, the surface world? I didn't check what was going on up on the surface world. No one cares. It's just surface stuff. Like, what happened up there, Volko? Oh, nothing important. It's still there. That almost implies that Forever Evil doesn't even matter, That the threat of the crime syndicate didn't matter at all in the greater context of the DC universe, and Forever Evil was still being published when this issue was released. That story isn't finished over in the corner of the DC universe that it occupies, so this moment really feels like a little bit of a backhanded comment, and it feels kind of lazy from a storytelling perspective. Johns could have just literally not had Aquaman be a part of the Trinity War crossover or the Forever Evil story at all. He could have just been so busy with Atlantis stuff that he couldn't show, demonstrating that the dangers of having so many responsibilities fighting for one time eventually costs somewhere. Then he could have been stabbed by the Dead King, and been in a coma for 6 months, allowing his character to just sit out Forever Evil completely. If anything, I like the idea that Aquaman specifically can't participate in Forever Evil, and then when his evil counterpart, the Sea King, shows up, he starts the event already dead. It's almost like Jeff Johns is just like, I'm going to give the two water guys a pass on this surface conflict. Aquaman's in a coma, the Sea King's dead, everybody thinks Aquaman's dead, alright, let's go on with the rest of the narrative. I like the balance of that. That does mean that Black Manta would lack his own motivations to go against the crime syndicate, thus changing his story elements in Forever Evil. But come on, man! Pick a story and tell it properly! I mean, I guess he did pick a story, and he picked Black Manta's. I just don't like that choice. Aquaman's got the comic. It's Aquaman's comic. It's not Black Manta's comic. Do a different comic if you want to do a Black Manta comic. I do think that the market's big enough to have an Aquaman comic and a Black Manta comic. And if you think Black Manta's an interesting enough character that you're like, I gotta shoehorn him into Forever Evil, and then after Forever Evil, he goes into the Suicide Squad. Like, clearly, people want this character around. Just make a comic featuring him. I don't know what he does, other than try to kill Aquaman, but I mean, you could do it. Anyways, back in the comic. In Atlantis, the city is still shattered by the Scavengers' attack. Several broken submarines litter the landscape. Massive glaciers of ice have encased much of the city as well. Have you found them? The Dead King asks Nereus. He reports that they have searched. Have you forgotten since you left on your quest? The Dead King asks. On one knee before you address me. Nereus stares at him for a second. And then he does indeed drop down to a knee. They have searched for the deserters for months, and they have found nothing. My king, there is no sign of them. Then they have moved, the king reasons. Their kingdom has traveled through the sands, hiding from me. They all are. The seven seas will be found, and they will be mine. You have us hunting ghosts, Nereus says. And you will continue to do so. Now the king manifests an icy image of Mera. Or do you want to join your queen? The image shatters. Or perhaps you wish to see Mera join those who have tried to stand against me. Nereus glares for a time, but he acquiesces. "I'll leave in the morning, my king." Nereus travels to Mera's holding cell and asks for a status report from the guards there. It's been 2 days since she last had any water, because she keeps using it as a weapon to try to escape. Twice now, she's actually used her hydrokinesis outside of her cell, so they've had to keep expanding the cell, building it bigger and bigger. She's managed to kill 3 guards so far, and she has put a crack in her wall. Nereus contacts her over a computer that is embedded in the wall. "Mera, you don't have to live like this. Just agree to marry me and I can have you released. Be my queen, like you were promised to be." Her throat croaking with thirst, Mera tells him that she already has a king. And if Nereus ever does release her, then she promises to kill him. Nereus starts to tell her what a fool she is being. Arthur is dead. But then the screen turns to static. They all turn, and behind them, they see Aquaman wielding the dead king's scepter. Behind him is an army of not just sea life, but also the trench. Arthur is not dead. Aquaman breaches the cell immediately and frees Mera. They embrace, and he promises her that he will always be there for her. Nereus, of course, orders his men to capture his queen once again, but Mera won't let that happen. She uses her hydrokinesis to take down the guards. Arthur wants nothing more than for the two of them to stay together, but they're on limited time here. He's controlling the trench, but he has no idea how long that'll actually last for. They need to free the rebels as fast as they can, so they're going to need to split up. They do, with Arthur being the one who frees Tula and Swat from their prison cell. The pair apologize for abandoning the city, claiming that this is all their fault. They didn't trust Arthur, and then all of this happened. But Arthur doesn't take it personally. They didn't trust him because he hadn't earned their trust yet. Maybe he still can. An explosion of ice rocks the space behind Arthur. The dead king swims in, freezing the trench with ease, an army made of Zebels at his back. "Atlantis has a king," he says. "You think you control the trench with my scepter? It's fooled them into thinking you are me, and you are not." Aquaman dodges the quickly growing icicles, but doing so does distract him. The king rushes in and stabs him with his trident. Volko rushes in, pushing the king back. He is the king now. Arthur is the king, and I will die protecting him. The dead king swings his arms, flinging the old man off of him. "Atlantis has turned against me. The trench have turned against me. I am betrayed once more." He picks up the king's scepter. "My dream really is dead." The king swims above Atlantis and points his scepter downwards. "I destroyed Atlantis once with this scepter, and I shall destroy it again!" He plunges to the ground. We see Volko looking up in horror, but Aquaman intercepts the strike, catching the blade in his hands. The ground under his legs shatters with the impact as he is pushed downward. "No, Atlan! Atlantis is under my protection now." Nearby, even Merc is impressed by this display of strength. "Did you see that?" he asks Mera. "How did he catch that scepter?" Tula isn't listening to this, and she encourages everyone to keep freeing more Atlanteans. "They've got Zebel on the run," she shouts. Aquaman and Atlan are both holding on to the scepter, a golden glow suffusing them. "I know what my family did to yours," Arthur says, "but Atlantis isn't your enemy." "Yes, they are," the dead king replies. "You are." Ice jumps over Arthur's hands, freezing them. He concentrates, and then he pushes the king back in a burst of speed. "That's the curse of being a king. I am who I have to be," Arthur says, shoving Atlan through buildings. "And if it means being your enemy, then so be it." He wrests control of the scepter away from Atlan, and then he throws him down to the ground with enough force that the landscape splits, revealing a glowing pool of magma. The release of pressure causes the magma to briefly burst upward, catching Mera's attention over from the battlefield. The burst of magma also flash boils the water, creating a cloud of steam that obscures Arthur and the dead king. Arthur is strong, Mara says, but that heat. In the steam cloud, Arthur has the dead king pinned to the ground, to the magma, with his scepter. He begins to scream as the heat starts to burn him and then melt him.
You, my family. I'm finally going to see my family again.
The trench flee the conflict with the Zebels and the Atlanteans as the scepter begins to melt, too. The scepter melts into liquid gold, and the dead king just melts away. Mara peers through the red steam, shouting for Arthur. And there he is. Aquaman bursts through the water and the lava, singed but alive. As he swims towards the others, a soldier approaches him, offering him the king's trident. Arthur accepts it, and then he and Mara kiss. Nereus, embarrassed, defeated, and angry, flees, as does the rest of the Zebel forces. Sometime later, as she finishes reporting this, Mara adds that they should leave too. After everything that's happened down here, Arthur surely can't be thinking of staying. I have to, Mara, he says. I have to find a way to protect what's left of the Seven Seas and find some way to unite the land and the sea. It's a responsibility that he just can't ignore anymore. Mara moves closer to him. That responsibility destroyed Atlan's family, and it drove him insane. You'll spend your entire life trying, Arthur. Looking over the city, Arthur replies simply, however long it takes. Now Mara swims in front of him, trying to confront him. This is never what you wanted, she says. You will never be happy here. Arthur looks into her eyes, and he says that he could be. If she stayed with him down here, they could fix this together. With her, he will be happy. I will always be happy with you, Arthur promises. Tears well up in Mara's eyes, and she turns away. I'm sorry, but I can't. She swims away. Arthur calls after her. He reaches out, but she's gone. She returns to Amnesty Bay, and we see her standing on the pier, looking over the ocean, with Aquadog by her side. Jenny, her one human friend from the grocery store, walks up with Salty's dog bed. Salty? The dog's real name is Salty? When the floop did that happen? I thought we all agreed that it was Aquadog. Anyways, Jenny has been watching Salty while Mara was out of town, which I think is a hilarious way of saying kidnapped by an undead king and then held prisoner for like 6 months. But, she did like watching the dog. She's actually going to miss having him around. If you ever need him sad again, call me, I'm your woman. In Atlantis, we find Arthur sitting on his throne. Finally. For the first time since becoming king does he sit upon it. His head is resting on his hand, his thoughts dark, and a shadow passes over him. He looks up in surprise, maybe in horror, and he finds Mara. Without saying anything to him, she sinks into the throne next to him. The pair clasp hands, and a burst of bubbles seems to rise up behind them. It's almost like the sea itself approves. Mara smiles at Arthur. Just shave the beard. He does, and we end with the pair swimming joyfully with a squad of sea life. Arthur's story is done for now, but this story has always been bigger than just Arthur's story. In Hollyberry, Louisiana, inside a small house, a woman named Erin tells someone that Tommy is finally asleep. He can't get enough of your stories, she says, taking Orm a cup of coffee. They aren't stories, he says from the window. They're real, although they do feel like a lifetime ago now. In the window behind him, obscured by the rain, we see the ghostly image of his helmeted face. Do you want to go back to Atlantis? Erin asks. I thought so, Orm replies, but he lets the thought trail off. I thought people there cared about me, but maybe not. You can stay here, she offers. You saved us during the prison breakout, and you're protecting us even now. Orm takes the offered cup of coffee. It does seem like his people have abandoned him. But how long until the authorities find him here? How long until someone discovers that she's harboring a known terrorist? There is no way that this ends well for Aaron. And she holds his hands. Then we can go somewhere where they won't find you. So long as the wall nearest them suddenly bursts inward. Thankfully, Orm was the closer of the pair, so his body shields Aaron from most of the damage. He immediately takes up a defensive stance, shouting for her to stay behind him. "You are Orm, the rightful king of Atlantis?" a voice asks. "Who are you?" Orm demands. Nereus stands in the hole that he blasted in the wall and introduces himself. He is the king of Zebel, king of the second sea. He offers Orm his loyalty and his knowledge. He told the dead king that he couldn't find the other seas, but he lied. Now they must take their place amongst the others. The 7 kings will rule this planet once more. Orm's story is promised to continue in the pages of the Justice League story Rise of the 7 Seas. Which never happened, unfortunately. So we have 2 endings here, so let's do them one at a time, right? First off, I love this little epilogue with Orm. I do have mixed feelings about it. I do love it overall, but I've got mixed feelings. On the one hand, I did absolutely love Orm saving Aaron when it happened, and thank you for providing me with a name, by the way, and her son, Tommy. It was a great heroic moment for a character that we had been told repeatedly wasn't all that bad, but who we had also only ever see do bad things. Like, we watched him not only think about suffocating a guy by holding his nose, we then watched him suffocate a guy by holding his nose. It's pretty screwed up. But I do find it hard to believe that Orm would actually stay with Aaron for an extended length of time. We just don't have any reason for why he would do something like that. Orm's only demonstrated motivation is defending Atlantis and being its king up to this point. So why would he give that up to just live with some rando woman? I am also annoyed at his complaint that he has no friends in Atlantis anymore for just a mixed bag of reasons. First off, we have seen Orm say to his lawyer that he has friends in Atlantis before. That line combined with this one here would indicate that Orm thought someone was going to come and bust him out of Belle Reve. He was counting on it. But even if someone from Atlantis did come to bust him out, like, I don't know, maybe a squad consisting of Merc, Tula, and SWAT, just maybe, breaking him out of prison would still have been illegal. If he really believed in the authority of Arthur's rule, even if he didn't believe in the surface world's form of justice, then he would have been honor-bound to stay in that prison, right? Because remember, Orm has enhanced strength too. He could have broken out of Belle Reve at any time if he wanted to, in theory anyways. Maybe they had precautions in place to prevent that, but we certainly didn't see any of them, and we certainly weren't told about any of them, other than the idea that Belle Reve is made to hold superhumans. But, like, what does that mean when you can punch through walls, right? Like, we've seen Aquaman punch, like, a cliff off of a mountain before. I'm pretty sure Orm can punch through concrete. So if he could break out, and yet he didn't during all of that time, that means he stayed because Arthur sentenced him there. I don't like that Johns is showing us an Orm who obeys the law, but is then upset when his people don't break the law for him? Like, that sounds really weird, especially when Johns has gone out of his way to have Merc sell Orm as, like, the king of the people, right? Because he explains his actions to us. Like, that doesn't feel like a complex, layered character like Orm has been presented to us so far. That just feels messy and disorganized. It might be one thing if Orm had been sitting there, like, smiling inwardly the entire time, because he knew for a fact that, let's say Merc as an example, just because he's somebody with a name, let's say he knew for a fact that Merc was going to break him out. Like, Merc had sent him a message somehow saying that he had a plan, he just had to get the pieces together, and those pieces were Tula and SWAT. That creates a specific expectation by Orm. Okay, I know Merc's coming to get me. I just got to wait for him. I'm going to do that. That way, I'm not the guilty party here. Atlantis is the guilty party. And when the surface world goes to war with Atlantis, we'll just fucking
No swearing.
kill them. Because that's what we do, right? They're the surface world. They're a bunch of apes. Who cares about those guys? That expectation, when unfulfilled, would then leave Orm despondent. Merc, his friend, this person that he trusted and counted on and relied on, would have personally failed him. And I could see him wallowing in despair and being like, oh, my friends don't care about me. I'll just keep sleeping on this woman's couch because no one cares about me and the only connection I have is to this woman. Oh, it's so hard to be Orm. Which is still dramatic as hell, but I mean, he's related to Arthur and he's a big drama queen, so like, it would make sense. Otherwise, that complaint, which is a little complaint, I'll fully admit, it's a little thing I'm griping on here, but otherwise this complaint just feels petulant and childish from Orm. It might be that Orm's enhanced senses allowed him to hear Merc, Tula, and Swat's discussion when they were planning to break him out. They were just outside of the prison, but then they turned around. But again, if that's something that happened, it is something that hasn't been established within the story itself, and if it is what happened, then he also would have heard their conflict over how to do this. He knows that they were about to break them out, but then an attack on Atlantis called them away. And as a former king of Atlantis, who went to war with the surface world in order to defend it, wouldn't he be happy that they returned? There's a word. Wouldn't he be happy that they returned to Atlantis in order to fight back against its invaders? So, for me, this concept, this aspect of this scene is a flooping mess. But Nereus showing up and blowing a hole in the wall, I mean, that act just kind of boggles my mind. Like, they've got doors in Atlantis and Zebel. The Zebels have scavenged wrecked ships and planes. The door is not an unknown concept to them. Why does he blow the wall up? I mean, it's clearly done because in comic book terms, it's just way more flooping dramatic, and this is comics. Drama is what we do, as much as people want to pretend it's something more than that. But it does still feel a little out of place, like, I'm going to blow open your wall, and then be like, hey, form an alliance with me. However, I do like Nereus having kept the secret of the other kingdoms from the dead king. I think that's really smart. It's very clear from the one scene between Nereus and the dead king that we got in this issue that he was beginning to chafe under the dead king's rule. Even if Aquaman hadn't killed the dead king, I do think that Nereus would have turned on him eventually. And not just because he's a bad guy and that's what bad guys do, but because he was literally like, I don't like this guy. I also don't think, and it didn't occur to me to complain about this earlier, I'm ad-libbing now, I don't know why Zebel agreed to work with the dead king. I mean, if the dead king is the guy who created Zebel to begin with, unless he somehow did it for an altruistic reason, he is still the guy who destroyed Atlantis. He is still coming here to take over Atlantis again. Why would they ally with him? You could say it's because they wanted, I don't know, more power, or they just wanted an opportunity to kill Atlanteans, but as seen by the fact that characters like Tula, Swat, and Merc were imprisoned, they clearly were trying to not kill whoever they didn't have to kill. Like, they were okay with just locking them up. The dead king does say, you don't want me to do to Mara what I did to the people who fought back, but, like, what did you do to the people who fought back? I'm assuming you killed them, because, like, this guy's an ex-conqueror and warlord, but, like, then why were Tula, Swat, and Merc imprisoned instead of killed? Those feel like characters who would have kept fighting, at the very least, Merc. This guy doesn't seem like somebody who would just be like, I won't fight to the end, I'll just fight until you punch me enough, and then I'll surrender, and you can lock me up. Like, that doesn't quite jive with me. But anyways, keeping the idea of the other kingdoms in Nereus' back pocket is a nice idea. Like I mentioned earlier in this episode, I had this huge rant about how Johns did all of this world building in creating these 7 different societies and cultures, and then he just wasted it by killing them all off, or at least killing off 4 of them in one issue. That world building is what I showed up to Aquaman for, right? That's what I loved about Johns' run on the Green Lantern comics. I wanted to see other undersea cities. I wanted new villains and allies and weapons, and I wanted an expansion of the mythology. Both Marvel and DC, in my opinion, really suffer from underdeveloping their aquatic worlds. They both have Atlantis, and that's it. This was Johns' chance to rectify that story problem for DC. Aquaman is king of 70% of the planet, right? But the only city that exists on 70% of the undersea planet is Atlantis? Come on. There's gotta be more. And then he hands us more, and they're destroyed. But in truth, the core kingdoms aren't destroyed. They've just been transformed. This is neat. And I dig that setup. We only get the barest glimpses of these other kingdoms, but they are there, and I do love that we see things that are hinted at. Like, they do look and feel distinct just from the small snippets that we get. The cover of issue 24 features a shirtless Aquaman rising from the depths upward, his trident held horizontally above his head. Columns and bubbles rise up with him, creating essentially seven columned panels on each side of him, and each panel represents one of the different kingdoms. One of them looks like it's made out of like algae or slime, maybe. Another one is clearly the desert, which we saw referenced. Then we've got the trench, Atlantis, and Zebel. Another one that looks like shells, or maybe crab shell, which is probably the crab-faced people. And then the final one looks like it's just murky and kind of shadowy, and it looks like there's blood in the water. I have no idea what that's supposed to represent, but still. There was clearly direction here for Paul Palletier as a cover artist to go in, so those places must have existed in Geoff Johns' mind. He had to give some kind of direction. Not getting to see those before the end of this run is a flooping storytelling sin to me. We do have the promise that Orm's story, this story, will continue in Justice League. But that never happened. To say that it is a damn shame goes without saying, and it's probably the thing that I will forever mourn from this run the most. Like, the idea of there being 7 Atlantis-related bad guys who are going to be going up against the Justice League is perfect storytelling serendipity. The founders of the Justice League are often referred to as the Big Seven: Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, The Flash, Green Lantern. In classic continuity, the Martian Manhunter, and in the New 52, it's Cyborg instead. 7 heroes, 7 kingdoms, 7 seas, 7 villains. I just love that the real-world idea of there being 7 seas, because we refer to that, or at least humanity used to refer to the 7 seas, I suppose. I love that the real-world saying lines up so perfectly with the established lore of the 7 Justice League founders. That's, like, perfect. And I would almost argue that I bet Geoff Johns would be creating these 7 Justice League bad guy counterparts as like Justice League bad guy counterparts, right? You would have somebody who's like, this is the guy who's going to handle Superman. This is the character who's going to handle Wonder Woman. They would explore all of these dark aquatic aspects of we're the bad guys, and then you have Orm versus Aquaman again. Oh, that's great! Although, there's another minor complaint. If the 7 kingdoms became the 7 seas because specifically Atlantis sank, then why would the dead king refer to them as the 7 seas? Wouldn't he have known them as the 7 kingdoms for all of his life? So anyways, it's a real shame that we never got to see this storyline come to fruition. It's forever gonna bum me out, and there's nothing more I can say about it. As for Arthur's half of this ending, honestly, I kind of feel the same, that it's kind of half-assed. Scavenger's attack on Atlantis isn't followed up upon at all, nor is the fate of that villain addressed here. And yes, I do know that we saw him show up in the Black Manta issue, but like the Black Manta issue happens when in relation to this storyline? We don't know, because the weird timeline between the conflicting timeline between Forever Evil and this particular story is so muddled. Topo's status quo after his rampage isn't addressed at all. Merc, Tula, and SWAT appear to have returned to Atlantis and then accomplished nothing, which kind of makes me call into question, like, their usefulness, right? If the idea is that Geoff Johns removed them from Atlantis so that the Scavenger could come in and attack, you would think that they would have been useful in some kind of some kind of rebel force against the dead king, but apparently they weren't. And if they don't matter here, why did they matter before, right? Mara being on the scene didn't do anything. As much as I loved Geoff Johns' ability to weave all of those stories together as a way of challenging Arthur and putting him in a really good position to lose, putting him on the back foot so that he has to come back here. These plot lines just did not come together well here at the end. Most of these character stories feel either like abandoned, ignored, or at the very least cut short. And maybe they were. Maybe Johns was originally planning a much longer story here, and he just rushed it to its conclusion so that it at least had a conclusion. Every character outside of Arthur feels incredibly shortchanged in this. And I mean credit for finishing the story, but it does feel weak to me. Arthur's half of the narrative, though, works well, and to be fair, this is an Aquaman comic, and not a bunch of Aquaman with some random cast members. I love that Arthur gets rocked by this revelation that he isn't connected to the first king of Atlantis, and he doesn't really care. Arthur does the right thing, regardless of the cost and regardless of whether or not people want him to do it. That's been true since our very first story arc, and it is just as true here. And I love that about him. He allies with Volko, he allies with the Trench, he saves Mera and his people, and he kills the dead king once and for all before assuming the throne. An act which will allow him to continue to bring the two worlds of land and sea together. This book started with Arthur abandoning this very post, and it ends with him promising to see it through, no matter what it takes. That's some great character growth. Mera also gets a little tiny bit of character growth with her decision to stay by Arthur's side, even though it's going to be hard here at the end. When Arthur first took the throne again, Mera would not risk going with him. It was too dangerous for her, it was too risky, and she just didn't want it. But she sees the conviction in Arthur's eyes. She hears him say that he'll be happy so long as he's with her, reaffirming his love for her. He knows that this job's going to be hard. He just faced down the last guy who tried to bring land and sea together, and that guy went flooping crazy. And Arthur knows that the only way that he's going to be happy is if Mera is with him, and yet he is still willing to let her go when she goes. That's how much he loves her. And I think she realizes when she's talking with Jenny and Salty that she feels the same about Arthur. She could live on the surface world by herself. She's got a friend, she's got a dog, and honestly, what more do you need in life? But she doesn't have the man she loves. She'll never be happy up here without him. So she returns, and they start a new era of Atlantean history. The half-breed king of Atlantis and the queen from Zebel. That's pretty great. It's adorable, and it's sweet, and it's kind of a fairy tale ending for this fantasy-inspired superhero comic. Of course, that doesn't mean that it is the end for Aquaman, who still has an ongoing series to this day, baby. You can't keep a good Aquaman down. But it is the ending for our coverage of Arthur's story. In our next episode, I'll be doing my full series review on Johns' run of Aquaman, exploring its themes, its missed opportunities, and where it ended up going in the future. Join me in a week for Comic Book Breakdown episode 26.22 of Aquaman. Fair winds and following seas. If you enjoyed this episode of Breakdown, please make sure to hit that like button, and if you are not subscribed to the show, then click on that as well. I love getting feedback, and I would really appreciate it if you did so. If you have any questions, concerns, or would like to suggest a comic or a series to me, Breakdown can be found on Facebook, Instagram, and on a variety of podcast platforms, with links in the description for this episode below, as well as the email cbbreakdown@gmail.com. Thank you for your time and attention.